Hotep, greetings. What I want to kind of talk about in this post on this particular video, I want to continue the discussion on some of the origins of dark magic, vampirism, dealing with Apep or Apophis. So Egyptian vampirism and Apep magic, the origins of this in ancient Egypt. Now again, something that baffles me and continues to baffle me. And I've said this, on numerous videos and even have mentioned it in some recent videos. Nobody really talks about the origin of this dark magic, this sorcery, this vampirism, in depth in relation to ancient Egypt. We always just hear, the one side or aspect of Egypt. We hear a lot about Ma'at, and to an extent, it all has its place, but you need a combination of both. As I said before, an adept and a black magician is able to combine both aspects of that magic, creating what we would call harmony. Not so much balance, because really Ma'at represents that harmony. Some will call it balance. But when things are kind of balanced, as we said before, symbolically that represents being stagnated, more so at a standstill. And that's not the type of balancement you're seeking. You're seeking more of a harmony. So there is that play with Ma'at and balancement, or what we would call the lighter spirituality or the lighter magic of ancient Egypt. But what is not focused upon enough, or more in depth and more in detail, is what we would call black magic, dark sorcery, vampirism, which again has its origin in ancient Egypt. So I want to make that crystal clear. So we're going to go over a couple of things to kind of touch on that. And I've been taking, excerpts and giving you references from, again, different books. I've been going through the second Apep book, by Michael W. Ford. Some of the other information that I'll be pulling from is the book set. If you don't have that book set, by Don Webb, I can get me the other author's name. See, I'm drawing a blank right now, but Don Webb is one of the authors in that book. There's many books out there. You can Google the subject. You can even go back to some of the old books of E. Wallace Bulge, who put some books out back in the early part of the 1900s, and touched on a lot of these Egyptian dark magical principles, working with spells and connotations. And as I said before, when you read the Coming Forth by Day, you go to spell 82, 24, spell 7 and 8, it deals with the spells of dark magic and sorcery, Apophis and Apep. And this is important to understand, because we gotta stop taking a lot of these ancient sciences that dealt with this black magic power and fluffing it up and softening it and making everything look like it's always been about, peace and love and just this more passive side. That's not true. That's not how we sustained our power as deities and gods. So what I want to go through, some excerpts here. I want to go through Egyptian vampirism and Apophian vampire magic in Egypt. Now, the term that they'll use in some of these excerpts, which actually comes from the Arabic language, al-Khem, or Khem or Kham, as some pronounce, which basically comes from the Semitic language of Arabic, and it basically just means black. So when you say that you're a chemist, for an example, the word chemist, you're basically saying you are a black scientist. Now, people give you different theories. The land is called Al-Kham, or the black land of ancient Egypt, because of the soil. It's a combination of both the soil and the people. We know the ancient Egyptians, obviously, if you're pretty stupid if you can't figure out by now, you're even debating if the ancient Egyptians were not melanated or black. Unfortunately, you still got ignorant folks that refuse to accept that, which they're in denial. And as they said, denial is not just a river in Egypt, it's also denial of some shit that people suffer from, which is a whole nother story. But keep in mind, and if you're wondering why one of the reasons I named this channel Mother Nubia, because remember, Nubia is the mother of Egypt, because the ancient Egyptians came out of the land called Nubia. So that's important to understand. Because the Nubian dynasties, when you go up into what they call Aswan or Sudan, as I mentioned before, you will see more pyramids in Sudan or Nubia than you do actually in Egypt. And when you study and do the research on certain deities, and I think I mentioned this before in some older videos, the deity Bes, for an example, who's a pygmy deity, is kind of a road opener deity, a protector deity, protects the children in the wombs of the mother, etc. That's a deity that has its origin in Nubia. And when the Nubians migrated into what we call Egypt, they bring some of those deities and part of that culture with them. So remember, the Nubians predate the Egyptians. And again, hence, if you're wondering, that's the reason why I call this channel Mother Nubia, because of that particular reason. That is the mother and the foundation of a lot of these spiritual sciences. And there's no doubt about that. So let's get into this a little bit. The foundation of all magical practice is found in the essence of predatory spiritualism. Remember, vampirism deals with the predatory aspect of spiritualism. And what that basically means is you're either predator or prey. That's life in general, anything, on a mental level, a physical level, on a spiritual level. So we talked about that. We've done radio shows on it. I've even did a whole video on that. Are you predator or prey? That's the reality. You're one of the two. Okay? Since the mastery of the Roman Empire, Christianity has perverted so-called practitioners of magic and slowly destroyed the foundation of the adversary. Now, this is interesting because the word Satan just means adversary. And that's why I told you, they've even taken the symbolic archetype of the adversary and embedded it and indoctrinated. Christianity did that, and embedded it and indoctrinated it and made it religious. And then not only on top of that, they also made that separation of, they classified what was good and bad. And most people fell for that classification. And this is how faith, belief, and ideologies and dogmas started to form out of this. This is important to understand. Okay? And they replaced it with a Benin tyrannical being, which in numerous masks or forms equals the Christian God. Initially, the power of Heka, or magic, and I've done a whole video on Egyptian Heka, Heka. Well, I'm going to get a little bit into that, which is the origin or the real ancient science of Egypt. What we call that black magic, sorcery, etc. It's one of the most powerful forms of spiritual magic, but you don't have people talking about it on a level that it should be talked about, because if we keep getting fed history and historical facts, and I've said this a million times before, that's only going to take us so far. What good is all this history and this so-called information, but we can't utilize any of it? So we need to focus on our natural spiritual power and ability that lies dormant within us, which that's what makes us a god or a goddess and gives the ability to rise to that deityship. And this is when we can bring about great change. Not just reading about and talking about how great we used to be in the past. I told you I passed that stage years ago. I'm done with that shit. I really couldn't care about listening to lectures about, I'm not interested in the historical significance of which dynasty was first and which came after, and fighting over geographical facts. I mean, that only serves a certain purpose. Okay? Because anybody can research and find that shit. But I'm not going to get sucked into nonsensical back and forth, garbage over stuff that's relevant in 2017, when you see what's going on in the world, you see what's going on the planet, you see things changing, and we got to start making sure we're evolving and changing with it, or you get lost in the shuffle. You understand? All right, so it goes on to say, initially, the power of Heka or magic was found in both darkness and light. Ra and Set, or Apep, the powers of the sun and darkness, eclipsed moon. Alchemia, or alchemet, is the very process of which the working, manifest, and the central aspect of initiation into the magical current. The ancient Egyptians held much symbolism concerning the black and white art called alchemy, alchemia, all right, which alchemia is a term to describe the combination of combining both black and white magic. Now I'm going to get a little bit further because it's going to explain how the ancient Egyptian black magician, okay, didn't separate the two, knew how to work with both. And I've always said from day one, when you study real magic, there's no difference in the energy. It all comes from the same source, okay? It's just a matter of understanding the different vibrations and frequencies that resonates from the magic or the current. You used the term earlier in here, the magical current or energy that you work with. So a real magician just needs to educate and discipline themselves on when to access certain parts of that current or vibration to use it and apply it in their magical working. Meaning there's sometimes where you need more aggressive and intense or dark magic that carries an intense, strong vibration. Whereas if you're working with more of a laid-back healing type of energy, then you need to focus and shift more to what we would term a lighter or a white magic. But the real science of alchemia and even certain aspects of vampirism is knowing and educating yourself to the science of how to work with that current or energy. It's that simple. We make this shit complicated sometimes. But this is what the ancient Egyptian magicians were able to do. Okay? Alright, so then it goes on to say, this meant no negative connotation. Simply the Egyptians utilized the belief that the working of specific alloys and fluxes represented the making of weapons and various other tools were related to magical practice. Okay? The earliest texts relate the Egyptians' form of magic, or Heka, as being the force from which all must become attuned with before death. So this was a standard practice in ancient Egypt. One had to, as it says here, become attuned with this science before death, because one of the core foundations of this magical practice and system was, if one was attuned with this science before death, it would elevate their soul in their travel to what we call the netherworld, or the necropolis, right? And there's a science in that Greek word, necro, right? You hear necrophilia, necromania, necromaniac. The word necro just means dead, okay? Pay close attention to that. The Greek word they use in some of the Greek Egyptian texts is the necropolis, where they say that Anubu or Anubis is the ruler of the necropolis, or the realm of the dead. Now I find this also interesting phonetically. It's not a coincidence that they'll use the word, that phonetically the word necro and negro are almost phonetically the same. So you can look at that term in two aspects. You can look at that term as meaning dead in a bad sense, or you can look at that term as meaning dead in a good sense, because tapping into the abode of the dead, which is actually the abode of the living. All right. Then it goes on to talk about. Let me skip down here. It goes down to talk about becoming attuned with the science to survive in the land of the spirits. In 4,300, now again, being tuned with the environment, the land of the spirits is that necropolis, that abode, some call it the netherworld, the land of the dead. And as I said, remember, the dead is actually the living. Don't get that twisted. Or what we call the afterlife. All right. Then it goes on to say, there are depictions of demonic type destroyer of hearts who sought to devour those of a priest of the ancient land. All right. I'm going to skip some of this because it gets into some of the things and the symbols. You'll see on the walls prayers to so-called demons that carried away hearts, who would not allow transformation, words of evil which would be spoken against individuals to have the gods embody him and dwell within his limbs. These are all symbolic terms, and a lot of this stuff you will see in spell forms and the different spells when you're reading the Coming Forth by Day. If you ever notice, when you're reading the Coming Forth by Day, you see in certain spells where you see the blank part where a name's supposed to be inserted. Well, that's the individual that you're working the spell on, which is important to understand. All right, then it goes on to say the quintessential aspects of the current of black magic is not dealt with within certain orders. The entire process of magic. Now, certain orders, there's many different orders out there that deal with this science. Not all of them do. You know what I mean. You have different esoterical society. I mean, you have the OTO, Black Order, the Dragon. You have different orders that do deal with it on some level. But that's a whole nother story. The entire process of magic, which refines and strengthens consciousness, this is important, and pay attention to this part. It transforms the psyche. Okay? It strengthens the conscious and transforms the psyche into a type of antinomian. Divine consciousness is magic in its purest form. Okay? Those who cling to ideologies which do not serve them are but crying as the predator draws close. They are unable to strengthen their minds, attune their bodies and spirits to the practice of magic itself. That which transforms is the fire which is joined with smoke itself, the union of the black and white. Alright? Let's go through this here. This is important. Consider the ure. These are the serpents. That's a term they use for serpents, which are symbols of power and wisdom, both of darkness, fire, and light. In the Egyptian ethos, the serpent is thus powerful and horrible, the very embodiment of the adversary. In its opposites, consider Set, darkness, storms and war, and Apep, devourment, darkness, and chaos. Okay, both represent an essential aspect of life in continual motion that one must occur to bring a balance to the other. Alright, I'm going to repeat that again because that's important. And we kind of talked about this. This was on, I think, 2 videos back, I'm going to say. 2 or 3 videos back. The symbolicism of serpent. Alright, so I'm going to read this again. The serpents, which are symbols of power and wisdom, both of darkness, fire, and light. In the Egyptian ethos, the serpent is thus powerful and horrible. The very embodiment of the adversary is in its opposites. Consider Set, darkness, storms and war, and Apep, devourment, darkness, and chaos. Okay? Both represent, it's important of the symbolism and what it represents. Both represent an essential aspect of life in continual motion that one must occur to bring a balance to the other. And that's what I meant earlier when I was simply talking about using both aspects, not just focusing on one. When you look at the symbolism, Set, storms, darkness, and war, those challenges and obstacles that one deals with on that path comes out of that chaos or darkness or storms, right? Apep is the symbolicism, as it says here, the devourment of the darkness, or one that consumes or is able to overcome the challenges of that darkness or obstacles. You can't have one without the other, which in turn goes back to, the philosophy of out of chaos comes order. And this is simply what it refers to. One has to understand that when working on this path. If you don't have a clear understanding of that, then you can't grasp, the spiritual science of quote-unquote alchemy, as it's referred here, working with both aspects of this energy. Just like when you also look at, there's an aspect they call of Seth Horus, right, or Set Horus, right? You might see this image, or you'll see this illustration shown in different text on certain, carved on certain walls in the pyramids. You'll see it'll be one body and 2 heads, one of Set, one of Heru or Horus. Now, what Set Horus represents, and this would be a good example this would be a really good example of a representation of that balancement of both magical energies. Set representing that darkness, that chaos, where Horus or Heru brings the more lighter side of balancement, the harmony. That's what Set Horus represents when you see that figure or that symbol. So what it's really showing the magician is that you need both sides of it. You can't just have one without the other. It's impossible. Where one thing is only focused on. That's important again to understand, because most people will focus on one side. Because what tends to happen when you work a lot of these spiritual systems, people tend to gravitate exclusively towards things that they like. Just because you exclusively like them, that per se doesn't mean that makes it 100% right. Sometimes people will do that and gravitate towards that because it just makes them feel comfortable, keeps them in their comfort zone. And it works the other way too. So I'm not going to say it just works one way. Then there's some people that will just grasp maybe only to the darker side, and not sometimes incorporating some of the necessary harmony. So the Set Horus personification or representation that you'll see in ancient Egypt, on the walls in ancient Egypt, you'll see it in different texts. You'll see it, in a multitude of places. Again, if you've seen it, you'll know what I'm talking about. I don't have a picture of it here. I don't. But you can see it when you pull it up. Again, you'll see one body. You'll see the head of Horus, and you'll see the head of Set. One's facing one way, one's facing the other way. Which even goes more in the aspect when you look at the story of Set destroying Osiris, right? Or Osir, and the body being chopped into, this is all symbolic now, it's not literal, being chopped into 14 different parts, right? That represents, the slaying of Osiris represents an individual overcoming those things that symbolically make them weak. Then the continuation of that symbolicism is continued in the ongoing war between Horus and Set, because even when one overcomes the weaknesses that limit them, there's still an ongoing persistence for those weaknesses to still rise to the surface. Hence, you have the symbolicism of Heru or Horus. So there's the constant battle of the godlike aspect of Set always doing battle with the lower self, or which is a representation in that continuing story of Heru or Horus. This continues on when you read, obviously down. You'll see this story repeated in multiple cultures, be it the Sumerian stories, the Bible stories, Cain and Abel. It's all the same story. It all represents the same thing. Again, people get more caught up in the literalism of it and want to debate the historical aspect of it, and that's the problem. Because we're sitting there debating something, quote unquote, that's not literal. It's symbolic, and you're supposed to draw on the metaphor of it, or what we call take on the deity or the deific mask of the archetype and embody it, not get caught up in the literal aspect of it. Because what happens is, when you start debating the historical aspect of it, you're going to get stuck, because you're going to stumble across a whole bunch of inconsistencies that just are not going to make any sense, which makes most of these arguments personally pointless, and they don't hold any weight. So that's a problem, and that's not what these stories represent. But unfortunately, you got all these nutheads on YouTube making videos about shit that's pointless, because you can't use any of this stuff to apply it, unfortunately, in 2017. So the Set Horus representation, again, not to dwell on it too long, because I'm going to get through a few other things before I wrap this up, represents that harmony that one is seeking when working with that current of a black magician. Okay? And in that one statement alone, there's so much you can draw from that if you meditate and focus on it. Okay, the idea of immortality was with the ancient Egyptians, whose god Khepera, or some will see in the form of the scarab beetle, which represented the struggle to become and continue conscious existence. The Khepera was able to give spiritual life into a dead body again in the underworld and would bestow immortality. Now, I did a whole couple videos on that Kepera, which is really coming into that awareness that I've come into being. You come into the realization of, it uses here, to continue conscious existence. But Kepera goes even a little deeper than that. Kepera represents to the black magician that they have come into being. They've come into the being of the self-realization of who and what they really are. Not who they thought they were, or not who they were striving to be, because who you thought you were and maybe who you've been striving to be is not actually who you are. And everybody is constantly experiencing Kepera. It's something hard to put into words, but a black magician is always striving to experience what they call Kepera. Very important. All right, so the second section I want to get through, and I'll probably continue this in another video. I want to get through this last section here. Just trying to time this. Magick and alchemy. And we talked a little bit about this. Egypt is one of the ancient origins of magic as a process of causing change or initiation. Now, the key part of that is change. Real productive black magic, or magic in general, brings about change for the better, change spiritually, change mentally, emotionally, and as I've said before, in some cases physically, because there is a physical aspect to this. A sound mind and a sound body, one is able to work more effective magic and absorb effectively the consciousness that magic projects. Al-Kemet is named after the color of the soil and the people. It is the word black which brings origin to alchemy. I kind of went over this in the beginning, so I'm going to kind of skip through this. Black and white magic were not separated in any specifics. Each could blend accordingly. I'll say that again because that's important. So it's not about being, quote unquote, into Wiccan or just nature and white magic exclusively, because that sets a false pretense, because you think everything is love and peace and be at one with nature and all that, and that serves a purpose to a point. I'm not saying that doesn't serve a purpose, but there's times where you need more, again, aggressive energy, dark sorcery, darker, more powerful, intense magic. So it's important because, as it says here, they were not separated in any specifics. Each could blend accordingly. Now, that blending accordingly is to the skilled and educated magician that knows how to do that. Let me stress that. The two specific types of ancient magic are that which transforms the self and that which compels or causes change in the world of the living or dead. So it depends on the system you're working. You can be working with crossroad deities, such as Baron Samedi, Baron LaCroix, Anubis. These are deities that work at the crossroads, or what people call the abode of the dead. You can affect change there. You can affect change in the realm of the living. It all depends on the purpose. The bearer of such would be deciding good or evil. God and often it depended on the association with nature and even the political alignment of the time. Now, that's more talking from a historical point, which would shape or determine what type of magical practice you would be working. The Egyptians were known to look past good and evil. Say that again. The Egyptians were known to look past good and evil as any common moral tone or association, drawing a rich understanding or utilizing the gods and goddesses to achieve the will of the individual of people. And as I've said a million times before, there is no such thing as good or bad. Again, if you go back into the 7 Hermetic principles, which are the core foundations for understanding the current or energy of magic, it breaks down in the doctrine of vibration and the doctrine of rhythm, to understand that they're just different frequencies, and one perceives those frequencies based on their experience as how they perceive or their perception on them. That's what this is talking about. That's why there is no such thing as anything good or bad when it comes to working this particular system. All right, then it goes on. This very grimoire will attempt to illuminate the black art of Apophis, which is a pep, the Greek term for a pep, Set and the gods of the sun. That dualism will be forgotten, except for the uninitiated. Let us gather at the source of the waters of the underworld and drink deep of this primal knowledge. Now, Luciferian has a bit of a connection to this. Luciferian magic presented here is of the depths of the abyss, from which the magician may grow powerful in the black flame, then only to rise up in the light as a conquering god or goddess. The black flame, or you'll hear the eternal black flame of Set, is that consciousness that always exists or emanates in that darkness or the abyss. Some will call that black flame neuromelanin. It's or as Dr. Edward Bruce Bynum calls it, dark light consciousness. It's that light that constantly shines in the darkness, and the darkness, as it says in their Bible, comprehends it not. It's talking about that dark light consciousness, that neuromelanin that constantly formed or formulated every aspect of consciousness that exists in the universe. The black flame is a term for that when dealing with black magic. Okay, that's all that means. Not to downplay, because it's very important. Okay, the alchemy presented here is a heresy among other magical systems. It demands the Apophian predatory instinct, the very nature of vampiric origin. Remember, absorption, predator, prey. The myth surrounding the Apophis of Pep describes an ever-regenerating serpent, right, seeking to swallow the sun. The purpose of a Pep is renewal and the darkness of chaos, which allows rebirth and evolution. Now, I'm going to stop there. Let me say this again. A Pep is renewal and the darkness of chaos, which allows rebirth and evolution. And the only archetype of deity that was able to control a Pep was Set. But it says this darkness and chaos is constantly evolving and rebirthing or regenerating itself, right? That's what a serpent does. You see, when you read, I believe it's spell 24, and they're coming forth by day. The spells I mentioned earlier, 7, and it's 20 something. I can't remember the other one offhand. It talks about symbolically what the serpent or Pep represents. It goes into the ground, into the inner parts of the earth, and comes out every day, which is symbolic of being reborn or regenerated every day. That's what a serpent does. As I said before, it sheds its skin. Every time it sheds its skin, that's symbolic of a rebirth, a regeneration. And the only individual that was able to keep that balanced, more so, or in harmony, in that sense, was who and what we call Set. And that's why we say Set represents the highest aspect or the highest deities of ancient Egypt, because of that representation. It's the isolated one, isolated consciousness, which is important to grasp. All right, so I'm going to leave it there. Just a couple quick announcements. September 29th will be our next event down here. More information comes soon on that. We'll get flyer and information out on that. We got the radio show on every other Thursday, the first and third Thursday of the month on TalkShoe.com. That's 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Didn't announce in the beginning of the video, which I should have, about consultations. If you're interested in a consultation, lasts up to 1 hour. It costs $52 to do it. It can be done via any social media. I prefer Google Hangouts. Skype as a secondary option. And it can be paid for via PayPal or Square. So I want to put that information out there so you don't have to contact me about how a consultation works. That's how it works. You can just contact me to set up a date and a time. I do require you to try to give me at least 24 to 48 hour minimum notice, because I just kind of go in order, take them as I do in order. So I want to put that out there. That's pretty much what I got for this week. I will continue this discussion and stay in this area of, dealing with the understanding, which is important, both of these aspects of magic in ancient Egypt. So we'll kind of pick up, from there on the next time, and get a little bit more in depth. And probably what we'll go through next time is some of the symbolisms, and what I mean by that, just to kind of give you a prelude to it. me see if I can pull it up in here real quick before we wrap this up. I just had it. Yeah, we'll get into like Sether or Heka, the Ka, the Ba, Gabet, what all this represents. The Ak, the Ku, Sekhem, Ib, Sekhem, Apep. We'll get into some of the symbolisms of that and what those symbolisms represent to the magician, because it's important to understand how to perceive that in working the spiritual path. All right, so we're going to leave it there. Peace.